This talk will be about one of the largest social dance crazes in history. That's the mid-19th century flourishing of social ballroom dancing throughout Europe and America. Today, I've heard the 19th century referred to as the age of the waltz. And although the 19th century contains several eras of dance styles and really cannot be characterized by any single dance, the age of the waltz appellation is understandable because the waltz set a new prototype for 2 centuries to come of close couple partner dancing. Not only the physical connection of partner dancing, but also the social relationships on the dance floor. The waltz was, of course, polite society's first close couple turning dance. It had been spreading throughout Germany during the 18th century, as you know, and the French bourgeoisie took it up enthusiastically immediately after the French Revolution. Paris alone had nearly 700 dance halls then. A German traveler to Paris in 1804 stated, quote, "This love for the waltz and this adoption of the German dance is quite new and has become one of the vulgar fashions, like smoking," close quote. Vienna's mass fascination with the waltz is well known, beginning around the turn of the 19th century, with many stories about a large percentage of the city's population going out waltzing many times a week, if not every night during fashion season, dancing until dawn. But it wasn't until the Regency era, around 1815, that English society was first exposed to it. Thomas Wilson wrote his book on waltzing in 1816. The waltz was criticized on moral grounds by those who were opposed to its closer hold and the rapid turning. Religious leaders unanimously regarded it as vulgar and sinful, but so did some others. In July of 1816, the waltz happened to be included at a ball given in London by the Prince Regent. An editorial in The Times a few days later gave a scathing rebuke. "We remarked with pain that the indecent foreign dance called the waltz was introduced, we believe for the first time, at the English court on Friday last. It is quite sufficient to cast one's eyes on the voluptuous intertwining of the limbs and close compression in the bodies to see that it is indeed far removed from the modest reserve which has hitherto been considered distinctive of English females. So long as this obscene display was confined to prostitutes and adulteresses, we did not think it deserving of notice. But now that it's attempted to be forced on the respectable classes of society by the civil examples of their superiors, we find it a duty to warn every parent against exposing his daughter to so fatal a contagion," close quote. Now, these illustrations, of course, are caricatures, exaggerating the features that were new and shocking. But we as historians can learn a lot by observing which aspects there were exaggerated. But despite reservations concerning the waltz, social dancing in general flourished during the Regency era, with a marked increase in public and private balls, the growth of dancing academies to teach the new steps, and the publication of dozens of instruction manuals, as you know. Dancing became an essential focus of social life, especially for the emerging middle class, which was rapidly gaining in its reach for respectability. We'll talk about that again soon. The quadrille was first seen in the ballrooms of London in 1816, and variety was provided by the continuation of the old English country dances, cotillions, Scotch reels, along with the écossaise, even the appearance of the older minuet, most of which are shown in this panorama. The Polish mazurka was introduced into ballrooms at that time, with Hart's first set of mazurkas, also known as Hart's Royal Mazurkas, with music descriptions of steps and the figures. Well, here's the description, the steps and the figures. Now, the Polish name of the dance was mazur. The English ambassador to Russia, the Duke of Devonshire, brought it back from St. Petersburg, where they had Russianized the word mazur into mazurka, Russianized. The parlor cotillion, later to be known as the German, was also new in Western Europe at this time. And this was a series of figures and games. This new cotillion was different from the 17th century squared set dance cotillion, even though it had the same name. Then, after a century and a half of French dominance in dancing, London now became the fountainhead for the new styles and fashions and standards. In the ballroom, the rigid hierarchy of Baroque court protocol and the display of performative dances in front of everyone, that was replaced by a more egalitarian set of rules for deportment that emphasized selflessness and generosity, offered with even-handed fairness to the assembled company. Now, normally in a talk with illustrations like this, I don't read quotations that you can easily read yourself. But I know, and I heard, that some of you are seeing this on a small screen or their phone. So I'll take the time for them just to read two quotes. The dance master Saltator captured this even-handed fairness very well in 1802. Not a frown appears in the group. Pleasure shines in their eyes. Conscious innocence frees them from pride. All with equal ease forget preeminence of rank. The dance master Charles Durang wrote, as his very first rule for behavior, the love for dancing and the mirth and gaiety of the ballroom should not be a selfish feeling. In the enjoyment of this most healthful and innocent pleasure, there should ever be a desire to promote the enjoyment of others. Consequently, every attendant at a ball, to be perfectly agreeable to himself, should study to be agreeable to others. Durang added furthermore, place everyone at ease in your presence. This is easily obtained by yielding a portion of your own personal comfort to that of the general company. Such amiable and self-denying deportment ever characterizes the polished and educated person, close quote. Many dance manuals reprinted the following advice. On entering a ballroom, all thought of self should be dismissed. The petty ambition of endeavoring to create a sensation by either dress, loud talking, or unusual behavior is to be condemned. It is necessary to forget oneself in order to be occupied with others without affectation, close quote. So this ideal was new at this time and quite different from the elaborate socio-political protocols prevalent in the previous French Baroque courts. This new sensibility laid the foundation for the preference of more modest and simple dances over the ornate exhibitions of the previous century. And the ballroom attire was also more modest and simpler. Ladies' lightweight empire fashions allowed enough freedom of motion for the intricate footwork required for many Regency-era dances. Women's gowns were light and sheer enough to keep them fashionably cool, although they were at times too sheer when it came to the intimate embrace of the waltz, possibly danced with a stranger, to intoxicating music. Because of the perceived indecency of the dance hold and the spinning, the waltz was considered unacceptable for public display by most ballgoers at the beginning. I don't mean to overstate this fact, for the waltz did have some avid supporters, but its acceptance was far from widespread. And did you know there was a bit of class division involved in the waltz's acceptance or rejection? For the lower classes, the waltz was essentially their dance, or at least it captured their fondness of a rougher kind of fun. And then the upper class, they could always do whatever they wanted to without reproach. But the middle classes have always been focused on upward mobility and were eager to appear more respectable, perhaps hoping to marry advantageously within the next few years. So dallying with a notorious waltz might result in a young lady being branded as one of those women and deemed ineligible for a decent marriage. One didn't know for sure back then, but it was best not to take the chance. English etiquette manuals of this period were rather conservative, and the American etiquette books were extremely so, often warning young ladies not to waltz under any circumstances. Social arbiters in Europe and America would continue to protest against the waltz, unwittingly creating a social pressure, like a pressure cooker building up, that would help launch a certain dance sensation a few decades later. Hey, it might be the name of this talk. Like the calm before the storm, the 1830s saw a relative lull in social dance activity. Ballroom floors became somewhat sparser as the freshness of the Regency era dances began to fade. Although dancing for pleasure did not cease, its social importance, it fell to the background. Many Regency era favorites vanished because they were no longer exciting and new enough to merit the great effort required to master their steps and their variations. The intricate footwork of the quadrille, like chassé, jeté, and assemblé, simplified to ordinary walking steps, pas marché, around 1830. Much to the annoyance of dance teachers who protested walking is not dancing. Social ballroom dancing was then also influenced by the Romantic movement at this time, with its poets and visionary dreamers. This was an era of exaggerated sensitivity, where it was fashionable to swoon or burst into tears at the slightest provocation. The Romantics sought escape from the industrial age, escape to artist lofts like this, or bohemian cafes, escape to nature, oriental travel, political idealism, costume balls, hashish, love affairs. Now, the sentimentality of the Romantic movement clearly set the foundation for the great fondness of dancing at that time and what was to come, but a lesser-known influence on dancing was the political idealism of Romanticism. The Romantics were especially fond of lost political causes, and they developed an affinity for oppressed and frequently conquered nations, such as Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary. Soon, the choreographies of French ballets began to include national dances from the Old World, which then gave these ethnic motifs, especially from Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary, an additional status as fine art. The Romantics also glorified the natural over the artificial, lending an especial appeal to the folk dances of the peasants because of their naive and unaffected natural charm. At the time, the waltz was gradually gaining acceptance in some circles, but it was still prohibited in many. By the end of the 1830s, dancers were becoming restless and ready for something new. In 1840, the Prague ballet master Raab traveled to Paris to exhibit Bohemian national dances, including the polka, on stage at the Odeon Theater. During the previous year, the polka had enjoyed successful debuts in Vienna and Berlin and St. Petersburg. And now the reception was especially favorable in Paris. Soon thereafter, French opera choreographers traveled to Bohemia to bring back more polka variations for their ballets. The renowned Carlotta Grisi and Perrault, shown here, danced the polka at the Paris Opera. Eugene Corrali and Marie Ballet performed it at the Variété. Upon each viewing, French audiences grew fonder of the new polka. And by 1842, the dance began to spread from stages to the public dance gardens, where off-duty ballerinas went to dance with their favored boyfriends. By 1843, a few young couples began to exhibit the polka at private salons and soirees for their friends who were so eager to see this latest sensation. More and more couples were discovering that the jewel of the stage was even more fun to dance than it was to watch. Then, in the famous winter season of 1843 to 44, the growing interest in the polka suddenly accelerated into a polka mania. Almost overnight, all of Paris became fascinated with this new step, including the most influential dance masters, Salarius, Corrali, Markowski, and Laborde, who all became tremendously busy teaching Parisians to polk. It was joked that Salarius, shown here, was so popular that the only hour that he had free, the only hour, was between 2 and 3 in the morning, quote, and that he selfishly insisted on keeping that hour for slumber. The French teachers were openly proud of their modifications to the Bohemian polka, which they said they considered too primitive in its original form for polite society. They claimed that they taught a refined artistic drawing room polka, suitable for the most elegant salons. However, we as dance historians, we need to disambiguate between actual modifications made to a polka and verbal justifications that dance masters thought were necessary to say to defend themselves from the protests of the large anti-waltz faction. In other words, it's quite possible that the Parisian dance masters taught the polka essentially as they saw it, danced by the touring bohemians, and just said that they modified it to placate their critics. Until we have a time machine, we'll never know for sure. But descriptions in Russia and Germany, where the polka was previously exhibited by Rob's dancers, they're identical to the Parisian descriptions. Either way, the Romantics loved this new peasant folk dance, imported from Bohemia. Or was it from Poland or Hungary? They weren't quite sure at that time. But the polka appeared to be a national dance from some politically oppressed country, and it was deliciously euphoric as well. All of Paris was now polking. The Paris correspondent for the London Times reported in March 1844 that, quote, politics are for the moment suspended in public regard by the new and absorbing pursuit, the polka. A dance master affirmed that the polka, on the first appearance in Paris, occasioned an anxiety and commotion that resembled an epidemic. Rutledge's Ballroom companion claimed that, quote, the polka's popularity was unrivaled in the annals of dancing. Rich and poor, young and old, grave and gay were all smitten by the universal polka mania, close quote. Now, this lithograph, one of my favorites, is entitled Le Grand Vogue de la Polka, rolling the R, can you see, in the French manner, and states at the bottom that it had taken over all of the districts of Paris. The German dance master, Friedrich Albert Zorn, who traveled to Paris to learn the polka, wrote, quote, rarely, indeed, if ever, has the dance received so much honor or so much attention as was paid to the polka in 1844, when the whole world wrote about it and talked about it and apparently thought little of anything else. Every newspaper contained essays singing the praises of the dance, he said, and persons dressed their hair a la polka, with pomade a la polka, ate cakes a la polka, wore gowns a la polka, and almost numberless musical compositions for the dance were published, close quote. Other writers added further that the dance created a rage for polka puddings and polka pubs, polka liqueur, polka hats, and dress materials. The polka dot became fashionable at that time, of course. Here's a cravat pattern from 1844. The polka was first developed in Prague around 1830. So it took almost 15 years for the polka to travel beyond the borders of its native Bohemia. But once it became popular in Paris, it spread like wildfire throughout the world. This was the first time in history that the popularity of a dance swept through several countries, crossing the Channel and ocean in a single year. The dance master Eugene Coulon traveled to Paris to learn the polka from Salarius and brought it back to the London stage in April 1844. England soon went completely polka crazy. In America, the New York teacher Eldegarma Brooks learned it from a newspaper article in the Daily Aurora, then performed it on stage at the National Theater in New York in May 1844. Soon the polka sensation began its spread through the States. Now, Americans were especially ready for the new step. After decades of social prohibition against waltzing, an entire generation had become fascinated with this forbidden fruit. Then, in 1844, hundreds of young people who so dearly wanted to waltz found that they could now do the polka waltz without reproach, because the polka was so sunny and good-natured that it couldn't be considered lascivious. It was said to combine the intimacy of the waltz with the vivacity of the Irish jig. Finally, modest, respectable young ladies could whirl in the arms of a dashing gentleman without raising an eyebrow. And they did, in most American cities, towns, and villages. The dance master Charles Durang wrote that, quote, "The polka soon gained a strong footing in America. The young, the old, and the middle-aged were roused by its attractions. Thus, the sedate and the joyous, the learned and unlearned, the professor and the mechanic, all were taken with its vivid and inspiring music and simple step and followed its measures with enthusiasm," close quote. As in Europe, talk of the polka overshadowed politics for many Americans. Some believed even that the little-known Tennessee governor, James Polk, won the race for the presidency that year, 1844, primarily because his name was so fashionable. An English humorist doubted that Polk was even his real name, joking that Polk was a pseudonym that he adopted to capitalize on the American polka mania. So in our country, it was the polka that finally gave couples permission to dance together in a close embrace, a tradition that has dominated social dancing ever since. For this reason, many historians today conclude that the polka was the world's greatest catalyst of change in social dancing. But that observation was nothing new today. 19th century writers made similar remarks back then. Durang stated that the polka caused so great an excitement in America, quote, "that its introduction into society may be regarded as the commencement of a new era in the art of dancing." Routledge's Ballroom Guide in London added that the polka had the same effect on, quote, "every capital in Europe. It effected a complete revolution in the style of dancing, which had prevailed up to that period," close quote. To the Americans in English, the polka had the additional allure of being the rage in Paris, which was the world's fashion trend center. As if we have not identified enough reasons for the polka's success, we should note that most of history's widespread dance crazes have been for easy dances that could be enjoyed both by skilled dance lovers and by the less adept. The polka was so easy that one could learn it just by watching it or dancing with somebody who knows it, without the necessity of a dancing master. And finally, the polka followed the dynamic of a fad, and thus became even more fashionable because it was believed to be fashionable, a fad. There are almost a dozen different reasons for the great popularity of the polka, not including the essential fact that it was fun to do, perhaps with the most fascinating creature in your arms, just when you might be looking for a marriage partner. And it was danced to spirited music by the greatest composers of the day, including Smetana, Waldteufel, Rubinstein, Lahner, Johann Edvard and Joseph Strauss, Stephen Foster, and Offenbach. Now, about these dozen different reasons, you might be wondering, is Richard just trying to see how long of a list he can come up with? No. The large number of overlapping factors is exactly the point. The polka was twice as popular as any other dance because it had twice as many social and cultural factors behind its success. Indeed, some of the polka sensation was the result of fortuitous timing, of all of this coming together. This is true of most dance crazes. Rarely, if ever, does a dance become an international phenomenon simply because an enjoyable new step is discovered. In fact, when a new dance becomes a hit, dozens of authors and dance teachers usually point out that the step had already been around for a while without attracting attention. This was true of the waltz, mazurka, two-step, cakewalk, tango, foxtrot, Charleston, rumba, Lindy Hop, and others, and it was especially true of the polka. For instance, you might find this interesting. The German dance master Zorn wrote that when he traveled to Paris to learn the polka, he was surprised to find a familiar dance, which as a child he had learned from his father, under the name of the Schottisch Waltz, or Scottish waltz, and which he had already shown to his pupils in Dresden in 1835, in Christiania in 1836, and in Paris he taught it in 1837, the Scottish waltz. It was like the polka. He continued, however, that it was not until 1844 that the dance became known in Paris. A critic later complained that he found Zorn to be a most irritating gentleman because he always claimed to have known about a dance before everyone else. But in this case, Zorn was right. When I looked through a German dance manual from the era of Zorn's father, written in 1826, I found this description of the Ekes's waltz, the Scottish waltz, which was indeed a turning polka, except it predated the polka, which didn't exist in 1826. And the polka had another forerunner. Dance masters pointed out that the polka was like the rotary gallop step of 1830. The turning gallop step was a waltz in duple time, very similar to the polka, but without the hop. In America, Charles Durang of Philadelphia wrote that the polka was of the hop waltz kind, which was already known to him. He was referring to the old German Hopswalzer, which had been transplanted to his city as the Philadelphia hop waltz in the 1820s. Here's what it sounds like. It indeed sounds like a polka, and it looked like one too, but it was 20 years earlier. So polka-like dances existed in several countries in the 1820s and 30s, but none of these early polkas caught on. The polka did not become popular when the step was first discovered in the 1820s, even though it was fun to dance. The largest dance crazes only occur when the time is right, due to a multitude of social, cultural, and even political catalysts. Then, in addition to being the rage in France, England, and the States, all in 1844, here's a Swedish description of the polka from Stockholm in 1844. The 1840s also saw polka descriptions in St. Petersburg, Russia, here in 1845. This is Italy at the same time, Germany, of course. This is Poland, and elsewhere. Now, our story would not be complete without giving a voice to the opposition, for not everyone was enamored with this new fad. Here we see a couple, can you see that, about to waltz over a precipice, a solemn warning. As the premier dance of the day, the polka was subjected to the kind of criticism that the waltz had previously endured. In the opinion of George Templeton Strong, it was a kind of insane Tartar jig performed to disagreeable music of an uncivilized character. The editors of the April 1844 Illustrated London News, note that it's April, believed it was, quote, a waste of time to consider this nonsense. The Parisians have never imported anything more ridiculous or ungraceful than this polka, they said. It is a hybrid confusion of Scotch lilt, Irish jig, and Bohemian waltz, and it needs only to be seen once to be avoided forever. George Templeton Strong, he never changed his mind. Years later, he wrote, I wish I had the man here that invented the polka. I'd scrape him to death with oyster shells. But the London News, it did change its opinion, publishing this illustrated description of the drawing room polka only a month after it claimed that the polka was ungraceful and only needs to be seen once to be avoided forever. The newspaper changed its mind and now assured its readers that, quote, La polka, as danced in Paris and now adopted by us, is elegant, graceful, and fascinating in the extreme. The polka revived the ballroom after 2 quieter decades, and dancing again was once thrust into the forefront of social activities. Young people fell in love with turning dances and looked forward to the next opportunity to whirl in the arms of a favored suitor or a cherished friend or an intriguing stranger. The dance craze then grew several times larger as the newfound passion for social dancing and turning dances led to an appetite for more and more steps to enjoy. The rousing gallop from 1830 was revived, often becoming the last dance of a ball. And the mazurka, which had not gained a large following during the Regency era, was also revived and now became the ultimate saltatorial experience for the advanced dancers. Mazurka waltzes were created by Parisian dance masters who combined the German waltz with various Polish and Bohemian steps, providing further changes that the more adept dancers could master. We're now to 1850, when variety was added by the schottisch and the schottisch quadrille, then spiced with dozens of unusual couple dances, such as the Hongroise, or Hungarian polka, the five-step waltz, valse à cinq temps, which was a mazurka waltz in 5/4 time, and a tango, claimed to be from South America, taught by the Parisian dance master Markowski in 1854. A supplement, a popular one, to the mid-19th century ballroom was the German, the parlor cotillion, which had continued to evolve since the Regency era into a collection of hundreds now of genteel dance games, novelties, and figures, and which could offer amusing ways to find a new partner. Some of these figures survive today as children's games, such as London Bridge, musical chairs, and blind man's buff. Last but not least, the polka rage finally brought widespread acceptance to the old waltz, once it was discovered that spinning in the arms of another did not destroy the moral fabric of society after all. The many dances that spun off from the polka mania were mastered by those who took the time to learn them in dance academies, as you would expect. And there were many dance manuals for the populace now. US had their American Lyceum movement of self-improvement. But more significantly, they were also assimilated into everyday use in private and public ballrooms. A typical grand ball of the mid-19th century featured the full variety of these dances, from the opening grand march to the final gallop. All of these dances, often with quadrilles alternating with couple dances. Now, one could possibly get by with only the knowledge of a few dances, but most dancers enjoy the complete spectrum of couple and set dances. Indeed, variety, that was an essential characteristic of this period. The dance master, Thomas Hillgrove, wrote, quote, "The lovers of dancing, like those of music, are ever fond of variety. Variety is and ever will be essential." Now, because the polka seems quaint and old-fashioned to us today, it's sometimes a revelation to discover how fresh, exciting, and even daring it once was, or how very young the dancers were. Did you know that some Victorian etiquette books suggested that the turning couple dances were most appropriate before marriage? Those who were married could dance the sedate quadrilles, or else might serve as chaperones to the young ladies. So, considering the early age of marriage in those days, couple dances were usually done by those in their teens and early 20s. Very skilled young people, many of who had taken years of classes in dance academies. Youthful energies were somewhat tempered by the strictures of ballroom etiquette, but we should resist the notion that the early Victorian ballroom was stately or courtly or somber. Many of the dances were joyous romps, performed with youthful abandon, until the dancers became, as Durang phrased it, red in the face and covered with the dewdrops of a high corporeal temperature, close quote. Metronome settings in mid-century dance manuals show that many of the dances were done at surprisingly fast tempos. Captain Knox reported that, quote, "Every ballroom was like a whirlpool. Dancing more resembled the driving home from Derby than anything else. The price of fans rose frightfully," he said, "partially from the pressing necessity for them and partly from the enormous destruction of them in the melee," close quote. Youthful enthusiasm sometimes resulted in mishaps and tumbles and torn dresses and bruised toes. Here we see the dangers of a military ball. A man tripping over his own sword in the center, dresses shredded by spurs on the right, and hair caught in an epaulette on the shoulder. So yes, a mid-century ball wasn't necessarily courtly, stately, or somber. So that essentially ends my talk on the great mid-century dance craze, but I still have 15 minutes left, and you might be interested in what happened in the remainder of the 19th century. So let's continue. After 15 years of enthusiasm for the new dances, the scene began to change. By the late 1850s, the dances had lost the excitement and novelty of a craze. Although dancing was still popular, it was not as brilliant as it had been. In addition, changing ballroom fashions influenced dancing in an unexpected way. Ball gowns had been expanding in size each decade of the century, and the accumulation of petticoats was becoming too heavy. This problem was solved just before 1860 with the invention of, yes, the hooped petticoat. This innovation had its advantages, but when it came to dancing the bounding polka or the exuberant mazurka, the hoops were hopeless, often bouncing and swaying out of control and exposing an ankle. The advent of hoops changed some of the dances. They modified the polka into a smoother version that became known as the two-step later in the century, and hoops effectively eliminated the mazurka and mazurka waltzes. Then in 1861, Prince Albert died, initiating a long period of formal mourning that further attenuated the dance festivities in England. In the United States, the beginning of the Civil War that same year had its own dampening effect on the frivolities of dance. But despite these multiple blows, the popularity of social dancing, it did not cease entirely. The tremendous momentum of the mid-19th century dance craze continued the importance of social ballroom dancing, far beyond the usual duration of a dance fad. Now, by the end of the 1860s, hoops were becoming ludicrous. The huge hoop skirts began to create navigational problems. A journalist wrote, quote, "Every woman today is a tempest. She cannot leave the room without knocking over everything," close quote. When the growing skirts could not expand forward, and this illustration is a bit exaggerated, but forward because you're holding a partner in waltz position, and it couldn't expand to the sides, to navigation through the doorways, they expanded backward. And that's an important trademark of the late 1860s. This illustration, which I just scanned yesterday, is 1867. This is 1868. Rumors circulated that the immense crinoline fashions were about to disappear. First, it was rumored that Queen Victoria would discard them. She didn't. The same was rumored of Empress Eugenie, then Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Many people had grown exasperated with the crinolines, but no one wanted to make the first move. 1870, that was a year of many changes. This might have been a turning point solely from the age of these fashions and the dances. The crinoline look and the favored dances were more than 20 years old, and now, therefore, belong to new society's parents. That's the mark of death right there. In addition to this, there was a tremendous effect of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which France lost. Parisians led a bloody revolution that deposed the emperor and established the Third French Republic. Life went on in Paris, but it was clearly time for a change. It was at this time that the designer Charles Frederick Worth finally succeeded in deposing the crinolines, which he never was fond of. He drew the skirt up to the hips over a padding of flounces, as you know, the bustle. This is a Worth gown from 1872. Worth declared that, quote, "The 1870 revolution is not so much compared with my revolution. I dethroned the crinoline." Then once again, fashions caused a modification in social dancing. Yep, again. As you see, these ball gowns have a train, don't they? There were little lead weights in the hem that swirled the skirt out away from the lady's feet while rotary waltzing, but the gent now had to begin by backing up against line of dance at the beginning of every waltz. In his 1875 dance manual, William de Garma wrote, quote, "If the gentleman is so inexperienced as to have the lady go backward, the lady should check it by immediately turning herself to the left or the right, at the same time notifying him that it is dangerous. And this illustration is from 1875, the same year as DeGarmo's advice. Regardless of the changes caused by fashions, the dances were changing anyway. Many of the turning dances that weren't killed off by the hoop simply died of old age, or they simplified, losing most of their variations. The mazurka and other complicated steps were now reduced to character dances for children, performed for parents at academy exhibitions. Dance masters, in an attempt to revive their dwindling clientele, as there was less enthusiasm now for all of this, they invented hundreds of new steps to replace the fading old ones. Why did they do that? Well, dance masters remembered from their early careers that the increasing enthusiasm for partner dancing, this mania of the 1840s and 50s, resulted in the creation of many new dances. Therefore, they reasoned that the creation of more new dances would increase the enthusiasm and bring students back to their dance academies. So they formed dancing master associations with annual conventions and created hundreds of new variations on the waltz, polka, mazurka, two-step, schottische, and gallop. By 1890, Professor Melvin Ballou Gilbert, shown here, had compiled 500 of these variations in his book. But the dance masters essentially got the cart before the horse, if you know what I mean. Enthusiasm leads for the creation of new dances, yes, but not vice versa. Almost none of the new late century variations caught on with the general public. And the repertoire of turning couple dances continued to dwindle in the late 19th century. In the 1880s, dance activity picked up a bit in society ballrooms, not because of any major innovation in dancing, but because of an increase in upward mobility in the middle classes. In order to step up in the social ladder, they sent their children to dance academies attended by wealthier families in order to mingle with them, and they looked for any opportunity to display wealth that they barely had. Even the wealthy were now trying to outdo each other, as elaborate private balls became the centerpiece of high society. The parlor cotillion, or the German, now became the favorite way to display one's wealth in the late Victorian era, as each elaborate dance vignette was accompanied by lavish favors that were offered at the conclusion of each cotillion figure, as a display of what they could afford. Meanwhile, by the late 1880s and 90s, the variety of turning couples had further simplified to only the waltz and the two-step. These are typical ball cards from that time. Waltz, two-step, waltz, two-step, waltz, two-step. I have many like this. And the even larger repertoire of quadrilles, all of these from the middle of the 19th century, they simplified to the plain quadrille and the lancers. This is a typical example. 2 plain quadrilles, can you see, and 2 lancers at a ball. And then by the 1890s, typically only the lancers. Here we see the lancers being danced 5 times in one evening, among waltzes, polkas, and two-steps, with no other quadrilles or set dances. Hey, look there on the left, you can also see the times, which is rare to find on ball programs. 8:15 in the evening, can you see that, until 2 in the morning? The last waltz is actually scheduled at 1:45, but notice that every dance has a 15-minute time slot, including for each waltz. While we're on the topic of these particular dances at this time in history, I think that a fun way to conclude my talk is with this dance. Does anyone recognize this? Here's the answer. Yes, it's the Lancers Quadrille, as done in London at the turn of the century. This was actually known as the Kitchen Lancers, and by these other names, and was an especially boisterous dance, as you can see by the names Rowdy and Breakneck. The name Margate there, that refers to the 1887 version, this one. Notice, can you see that they're running through the grand chain in the final figure? The kitchen lancers was initiated by the young dancers who were bored with the old lancers and the repetitious order of waltzes and two-steps at a ball. So some of them began to play around with the lancers quadrille and then to downright mess with it. And then, surprise, it caught on, becoming an increasingly popular way of dancing the lancers throughout London. Most dance masters at the time disapproved of the kitchen lancers, of course, but fortunately, they gave a very detailed description of exactly what not to do. All of these books describe the kitchen lancers. At least these are the ones in my collection. I found 26 sources from that time describing it. The kitchen lancers was a combination of certain choreographic elements and the manner in which it was danced. One of the principal choreographic features was the swinging of partners with a fast spin in place, which would later become known as the buzz step swing. I'm sure you know it, instead of doing a two-hand turn with walking steps. This new way of swinging was first mentioned by Rudolf Redstock, London, 1877. Then Edward Scott went into much further detail when describing how to do it in 1887. He also reported that the dancers found opportunities to spin partners in corners throughout the dance, whenever possible in the lancers, in every figure. The manner of dancing in general was most commonly referred to as romping. These are the lines of 4 gents and 4 ladies in the 5th figure. Do you know that one? It's romping. And this is the bumping race figure that often concluded the kitchen lancers. And that was named after the bumping races at the University of Cambridge. Some of the tunes for the kitchen lancers are indeed college songs. In 1892, Edward Scott observed that, quote, "The young ladies cheerfully submit to being vehemently twisted around and appear to rather enjoy being lifted off their feet." The lancers are good fun, but you have to be particular about the fit of your shoes. Yes, that's the first image that I showed you. It's rather hard to see exactly what's going on in this cartoon with everyone's feet off the ground. So this photo that I have from 20 years later is clearer. Only the ladies have their feet off the ground, just as Scott described. Dancing masters called this wild and irresponsible romping. They criticized it as rude, objectionable, outrageous, and exceedingly vulgar. But others at the time praised it. Quote, "The smart thing nowadays is to be smart, and the noble art of dawdling," meaning walking through quadrilles, "has died of being overdone. If this kind of thing were not liked, it would not be done. Vox populi, the voice of the people." Close quote. You can see here that the dancers doing the respectable lancers on the right have a railing to protect them from the rowdy set on the left. This is the kitchen version of the second half of the 4th figure, the visits. Prepared for the worst. If you can't read this at the bottom, the man is surprised. "Oh, I say, don't say it's fancy dress tonight, what?" And fancy dress back then meant a costume ball. The armored and padded women say, "Oh dear, no, only we girls have been so knocked about lately in the kitchen lancers that we thought we'd be on the safe side tonight." And this is from a 1909 issue of Punch. So the kitchen lancers remained popular for quite a while, until the war in 1914. And now that we're up to the 20th century, that ends my talk for tonight.